This planting season, when it was so wet here in Ohio, guys were calling, having trouble closing the slot here in the back with 2 rubber wheels or 2 cast wheels. We put the spike on one side, and it made a huge difference in closing that slot in the back because of these wet conditions this spring. Here's a flyer that we made up. We put it in some couple different advertisements here this spring to show guys the advantages of having the spiked wheel versus standard rubber closing wheels or cast wheels. It'll close that slot up a lot better, and your seed will have a lot better seed to soil contact, and your seed will emerge a lot quicker. This drag chain here is another Yetter product that we handle. I've sold quite a few of these, especially when you put on 2 spikes. Yetter recommends that you go with this drag chain to sort of smooth out the area where the seed is. If you go just with 1 spike, I would not really recommend a drag chain, but if you go with 2 spikes, I would recommend a drag chain. This will level out that planting surface after you plant the seed. What you're looking at here is the Yetter's Residue Managers. This particular residue manager here is mounted on the front of a 7200 series Deere row unit. What's nice about these residue managers that they came out with is, number 1, the shark tooth. They went away from the fingers and went to the shark tooth. This is a carbide tip. They're really sharp, so it slices up the residue and moves it out of the way at the same time. Another feature of this wheel is the gauge wheel on the side. The residue manager will only go in the ground that far. You just want these residue managers skimming across the top of the ground to move the residue out of the way, so your seed disc have nothing to cut through except for dirt. This particular residue manager here, as it is now, is in the floating position. It'll float. The pin on the side keeps the downward motion limited to where it cannot go down into the ground. How you have these residue managers set is you put your planter down and you go through and you set these residue managers so the residue manager is just skimming across the top of the ground. That's all that you want, just to get the residue out of the way. If you come to the front of this residue manager here, you'll see how these residue managers are overlapping. They're not at a V, they are overlapping, so there will be no ground that is untouched by this residue manager. You could either have them floating, or you can pin them to make them rigid. In most cases, depending on conditions, you're probably going to want them to have floating, but they do have that ability to where you can pin them and make them rigid. But this is something that with all this residue out there that's getting harder and harder to handle, these residue managers are getting to a point where you got to have these things on the planter to give your planting unit a nice level, consistent spacing, consistent depth in the ground, so you're not going over all the residue out there that these corn stalks are creating with this. These corn stalks are getting harder and harder to get rid of. Okay. This residue manager here is mounted on a white row unit. What we're showing here is this white row unit has a no-till coulter, and this residue manager wraps around a no-till coulter versus the other video that we shot of the 7200 Deere. It did not have a no-till coulter, so that residue manager on the Deere unit is tucked up underneath there, where this one here has to go out around the no-till coulter. But the residue managers are the same on both units. This particular unit here, it can also float up and down, and the downward motion is stopped by the adjustment pin, or you can have this one here in a rigid position also. But the only thing we're showing you here is a difference between a no-till coulter up front versus without a no-till coulter.